When we think of the Seymour family, we think of Henry VIII. We think of Queen Jane Seymour. We think of a family that went from relative obscurity to the very peak of power in the blink of an eye. But to understand the dizzying height of their ambition and the tragic depths of their fall, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to their humble roots. And that is what we are going to talk about today. We are going to trace the Seymours from their beginnings through to their fall and even where they are today and what happened to them after the Tudor period. So let's get started and discuss all things Seymour. Hello, friend. Welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast, the original Tudor history podcast, telling stories of Tudor England since 2009. I am your host, Heather. I am, as always, just delighted that you are here with me today. We are going to talk about all things related to the Seymour family. Let's get started. For generations, the Seymours were, for all intents and purposes, a family of solid gentry. The name itself, Seymour, is an English variation of the French name Saint-Maur, hinting at their Norman origins. They were well-established landowners in Wiltshire, with their primary seat at Wolf Hall. They were knights, they were sheriffs, a respectable class of people who had no reason to believe that one of their own would one day be a Queen of England, let alone the mother of a king. Their place in the world was solid, predictable, and frankly, a little bit boring. The real shift began a generation before Jane with her father, Sir John Seymour. Sir John was a career courtier and a soldier. He was knighted by Henry VII for his service and later fought alongside Henry VIII in the English campaigns in France. He was a man with a foot in the old world of military prowess and the new world of court influence. But his true political masterstroke was his marriage to Marjorie Wentworth. Marjorie was no ordinary gentry woman. Through her mother, she was a cousin of Elizabeth, Henry VIII's mother. Their marriage brought the Seymours into the orbit of the Tudor dynasty, and most importantly, into the same social circle as Thomas Howard, the future Duke of Norfolk. It was a strategic alliance that gave the Seymours the very thing they had lacked: powerful connections. It allowed them to move from the quiet countryside of Wiltshire to the noisy, dangerous, and intoxicating world of the royal court. But lurking beneath the surface of this respectable family were the seeds of the very drama that would define their future. Even before Jane appeared, the family was touched by scandal. Edward Seymour, Jane's older brother, the future Duke of Somerset, was caught up in a domestic drama that would have major consequences for the family. Sometime before 1519, he married his first wife, Catherine Filial. They had two sons, John and Edward. But for reasons that were never explicitly stated at the time, Edward repudiated his wife. Later, after the Seymours were at the height of their power, a scandalous and largely unsubstantiated rumor would emerge that Catherine had been having an affair with her own father-in-law, Sir John. The truth of the matter is lost to history. It makes for some really good historical fiction. But the outcome was clear. When Edward was later created Duke of Somerset, his patent of nobility explicitly stated that his titles would pass to the heirs of his second marriage. This legal document was the most public acknowledgement of the old scandal that the family could make. This family, the very family that was the subject of whispers, would soon work to present a perfect, quiet, blemish-free antidote to Henry's problems: Jane. They went all in on one bet: Jane Seymour. Jane, our future queen, was the ultimate observer. She had served both Queen Catherine and Anne Boleyn. Imagine that. She was the silent witness to Henry VIII's great matter, standing a few feet from the woman Henry had risked a schism with Rome for, and a few feet from the woman he was about to dispose of. While Anne was all sharp wit and fashionable French gowns, Jane cultivated a different image. She was demure, pious, quiet. She didn't engage in the courtly games. She stayed in the background, a symbol of domesticity. This wasn't coincidence. It was a deliberate strategy orchestrated by her brothers, Edward and Thomas. They knew exactly what Henry was looking for. After Anne's fiery personality and inability to have a son, Henry was desperate for a quiet and compliant wife. Jane was the perfect opposite, and the Seymours expertly presented her as such. A perfect example of this comes from a well-known anecdote. While he was still married to Anne, Henry sent Jane a gift of a purse filled with coins. It was a clear, if discreet, overture. But Jane, in a move that showed her deep understanding of the court's politics, took the purse and, after kissing the coins, handed it back to the messenger. She said she was happy to accept a marriage gift from the king, but she couldn't take a single penny from him before then without tarnishing her honor. It was an audacious and flawless political play. But the Seymours weren't operating in a vacuum. Jane's rise was actively aided by the faction at court that wanted to see Anne Boleyn's downfall. These were the conservative, Catholic-leaning nobles, many of whom had been allies of Catherine of Aragon. They despised Anne and the Reformation that she represented. They included people like Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, who had grown to resent his niece's influence. There was also the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a fervent ally of Catherine of Aragon. Though he wasn't particularly welcome to whisper directly to the king, he worked his influence through a network of spies and allies, including the notorious courtier Francis Bryan, a cousin of both Anne and Jane, known as the Vicar of Hell. These were the people who placed Jane in Henry's path, whispering to him about her virtue and humility, using her as a weapon against Anne. Jane's very lack of baggage was her greatest strength. The moment that Anne Boleyn was executed in May 1536, Jane's long game paid off. Henry married her just a week and a half later. The jackpot came with the birth of Prince Edward in October 1537. Jane gave Henry what he had craved for his entire reign, a male heir, a healthy male heir. The future of the Tudor dynasty was now, literally, a Seymour. Her victory, however, was also her end. She died just 2 weeks later, most likely from childbed fever. Henry was, of course, heartbroken. He would later choose to be buried next to her. For the Seymours, her death was a devastating loss and a triumph all at once. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas, were now the most powerful men in England. Their nephew was the future king. As soon as Henry VIII died, their position was sealed. Edward, Earl of Hertford, became Lord Protector, the de facto ruler of the entire kingdom. This was a whole massive political move because Henry had wanted to set up a regency council with no one in control, but Edward was able to use his power, his political machinations, and go completely against Henry's own will and become the Lord Protector. His brother Thomas was the Lord Admiral. They were at the top of the food chain with more power than anyone had ever imagined for their family. But power in the Tudor court was always a double-edged sword. In the wake of Henry's death, that double-edged sword was about to cut deep. The Seymour family, now at the absolute pinnacle of power, was about to turn on itself. At the center of this looming catastrophe were the two brothers, Edward the eldest, who had the quiet cunning of a politician, and Thomas the younger, who had the brazen, reckless ambition of a pirate. Edward was now the Lord Protector, the man who ruled England in the boy king's name. Thomas was relegated to the title of Lord High Admiral, a position he found utterly inadequate. He was a man with a massive ego, a bottomless appetite for power, and saw his brother's elevation as a personal slight. The rivalry between the two brothers began to escalate almost immediately. Edward's second wife, Anne Stanhope, a notoriously proud and ambitious woman, was a key factor. She was a constant source of tension, feuding openly with Catherine Parr over precedence, demanding a place among the royal family. A particularly telling and petty feud erupted over the use of the Queen's jewels. After Henry's death, Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, expected to retain a magnificent collection of jewelry. But Anne Stanhope, as the wife of the Lord Protector and the king's aunt, insisted that she should have them. A back and forth ensued, with Thomas Seymour siding with Catherine, we'll talk about why in a minute, further deepening the rift between the brothers. So Thomas wanted his own power base. He wanted a queen, and his first play was Catherine Parr. Thomas had had a romance with her before she became queen, and as soon as Henry died, Thomas wasted zero time, rushing to marry the Dowager Queen in a secret, hastily arranged ceremony just a few months after the king's death. It was a scandalous move that infuriated his brother and the rest of the Privy Council, who viewed it as a blatant power grab. It was also an act of pure emotional recklessness. His second play then was for the young Princess Elizabeth. Living in Catherine Parr's household was her stepdaughter, the teenage Elizabeth. Thomas, a man who liked to flirt and had a seemingly insatiable desire to be at the center of royal power, started to begin almost a relationship with the young princess that by any measure was completely inappropriate. He would visit her room in his nightshirt. He would slap her on the behind and engage in horseplay with her and her governess, Cat Ashley. Catherine Parr surprisingly initially joined in. Perhaps she thought it was all just innocent fun. But Thomas's behavior became increasingly predatory, and Elizabeth was eventually sent away from the household in disgrace. The drama reached a terrible climax in September of 1548, when Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. But the birth was followed by complications, and Catherine died 2 weeks later from childbed fever. Her death left Thomas with a young infant, and more importantly, without a key source of his political power. He was now free to pursue Elizabeth as a wife, but he was also a man on the ropes with nothing left to lose. He spiraled into paranoia and reckless plotting. He began plotting against his own brother, manipulating the young King Edward with money and favors, and even attempting a late-night break-in at the king's apartments in Hampton Court, where one of the casualties was Edward's dog, who was shot. He was eventually caught and charged with treason. His brother Edward now faced a terrible choice: spare his brother or execute him and consolidate his own power. He chose the latter. On March 20th, 1549, Thomas Seymour was executed. So what happened to the young Mary Seymour, his daughter? Well, born just 6 months before her father's execution, the orphaned Mary was placed in the care of Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk. The Duchess had been a friend of Catherine Parr's, but raising her daughter was a really big ask. She constantly wrote to the government complaining about the cost of Mary's upkeep and the lack of funding. Eventually, funding was completely cut off, and Mary disappeared from the historical record entirely after 1550. Historians can only conjecture about what happened to her. The most likely and most mundane theory is that she simply died an infant or a young child, perhaps a victim of the same sweating sickness that plagued so many during the era and would take Catherine Willoughby's own sons the next year. The most romantic and compelling theory, though, which is the subject of some historical fiction, is that she was raised in anonymity, secretly married, or perhaps even sent abroad to live out her life in obscurity. We'll never know for sure, but her disappearance is a fitting symbol for a family that seemed to burn so bright and then vanish just as quickly. So back to Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. He had survived his brother's plotting, but his position was far from secure. He was a new kind of ruler, a man who believed in a form of social reform and was seen by some as sympathetic to the struggles of the common people. You could almost call him like a progressive of the Tudor period, a man who saw the suffering of the lower classes and tried, somewhat ineffectually, to do something about it. This was most evident in his response to Kett's Rebellion in 1549, a major uprising in Norfolk sparked by peasant anger over land enclosures. While other nobles demanded immediate bloody repression, Edward tried to negotiate with the rebels and even issued a proclamation that acknowledged their grievances. He saw the rebels as his, quote, poor friends. This was an admirable, even forward-thinking stance, but in the context of the paranoid Tudor court, it was also his political death warrant. To his enemies, particularly John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, this was not compassion, it was weakness. It was an outright invitation to chaos. Dudley, a far more pragmatic and ruthless politician, saw Edward's populism as a threat to the established order and to the property of the nobility. He began to whisper to the other lords, pointing out that Edward's leniency would only encourage more rebellions. He gathered a powerful coalition of nobles who were disgusted by Edward's inability to control the situation and alarmed by his sympathy for the rebels. They accused him of treason, of inciting rebellion, and of failing to protect the realm. In October 1549, less than a year after he had his own brother executed, Edward was arrested and stripped of his power. He would spend the next 2 years in and out of the Tower, clinging to what little influence he had left. But the end was, of course, inevitable. On January 22nd, 1552, he was led to the scaffold at Tower Hill. His execution was not met with universal joy, and in fact, many of the common people who had once seen him as their champion now mourned his passing. His death completed the devastating, bloody chapter of the Seymour siblings. Jane, Thomas, and Edward had risen to unthinkable heights. Both Thomas and Edward met their end on the executioner's block, while Jane, of course, died giving birth to the next heir. With both of the elder brothers gone, it might seem as if the Seymour story had come to a definitive and tragic end, but that would ignore the family lines that remained. The future of the Seymours now rested on the next generation, specifically on the children of Edward Seymour. First, there was the line from Edward's first marriage, the sons he had repudiated years ago, John and the second Edward. We're actually going to talk about them second, because an interesting twist happened. Let's start first with the line from Edward's second, more politically advantageous marriage to Anne Stanhope. This line would be carried on by his eldest son, Edward, who for a time was the true heir to the dukedom. This Edward was known as the Earl of Hertford, and he would play a crucial role at the court of Elizabeth I. He was an incredibly ambitious man, and like his uncle Thomas, he had set his sights on a royal marriage. He secretly married Lady Catherine Grey, the sister of ill-fated Lady Jane Grey. Catherine was, at the time, a potential successor to the throne, and their secret marriage was seen as a brazen power grab. When Elizabeth found out, she was furious. She had them both imprisoned in the Tower and declared their children illegitimate. Catherine spent the remaining years of her life under house arrest, moved between various locations. She never saw her husband again, and she died in 1568 from tuberculosis and, they said, heartbreak. Edward, the Earl of Hertford, would remain imprisoned for 9 years. The marriage would later be declared legitimate by a new monarch in 1608, decades after her death. The children, initially illegitimate, were also legitimized at this time, completing a tragic and torturous ordeal for the family. The main line of the family was continued by Edward's son with Catherine, who was also named Edward and inherited the title Viscount Beauchamp. It was this younger Edward, who had a father named Edward and had a grandfather named Edward, so that's not confusing at all, but he broke the pattern and had a son named Francis, who would later be created Baron Seymour of Trowbridge. This Francis would be a key player in the next generation, a prominent royalist during the English Civil War. The descendants of this line would remain politically significant for centuries, serving in various capacities. Interestingly, the Earl of Hertford, though, the second Edward Seymour, the one that married Catherine Grey, he got married twice more, both times in secret. So he got married 3 times in secret. He had a thing about secret weddings, I suppose. But let's go back and talk about the children from older Edward Seymour's first marriage, that marriage to Catherine Filial, before Jane was queen, before any of that happened, that he had repudiated. So these would be the stepbrothers of Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the children by Anne Stanhope. So those sons are John and Edward, because naming your kids Edward seems to be a thing, right? Anyway, they'd been sidelined for years, but there was an interesting twist of fate that had the family's story come to an iconic full circle. They were actually the ones who eventually inherited the family's title and still have the title. This was because the patent of nobility specifically passed the dukedom to the heirs of the second marriage first, but that line died out. It wasn't for 2 centuries, though. It was in 1750, with the death of the 7th Duke of Somerset, that the line from Anne Stanhope finally ran out of male heirs. And at that point, the dukedom reverted, as the patent decreed, to the descendant of the first repudiated marriage. And that is where the current Duke of Somerset, John Seymour, the 19th Duke of Somerset, comes from that repudiated line with Catherine Filial. So over the centuries, the Seymours would serve in Parliament, hold military commissions, hold various other positions of influence. They never again reached the Tudor era heights of being a king's uncle or lord protector. So there we go, my friend, a little bit about the Seymour family. Still intact, albeit by that first repudiated line, which is quite ironic, and I really enjoy that fact. We will leave it there for now. Thank you so much for listening and for spending this time with me. Remember, you can always hop into the Tudor Learning Circle, tudorlearningscircle.com, a social network just for Tudor history nerds. Or you can leave a comment wherever you're listening to this. I do enjoy reading through your comments when I can. TudorCon is in a week and a half. If you still haven't gotten your ticket for TudorCon from home, now would be the time to do that so you don't miss out. englandcast.com/TudorCon from home. So I will be back next week with another full episode. I'll be back with shorter videos and content on the YouTube. But I will speak with you very soon. Thanks so much again for being here. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye.
Blow, northern wind, send who may be sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbricht, dat soll is